So this next panel is really looking at the idea of corporate culture and how you assess, implement, and then really monitor effective corporate culture in your organisations. I read once somewhere, I think it was by Ken Elisa at the Institute of Directors or one of the business schools, that corporate culture is like fine art. It's easy to behold, but it's kind of hard to actually understand whether what you're looking at is good or not. But really a failure in culture invariably lies at the heart of many corporate scandals, whether it's VW or the cooperative group we alluded to earlier, or Toshiba. All of them, really in one essence or another, even accounting scandals, places like Tesco's, have the genesis of their problems within the culture, within the organisation. But what actually is it? So hopefully my panel here now going to help understand some of that. So I have Mel Womble, who's a partner and head of the Leadership, People and Culture Practice for Grant Thornton in the UK. I have Julie Lord, who's head of Regulatory Affairs at PwC. And I have David Stiles, who is Director of Corporate Governance at the Financial Reporting Council. I think just to kick off with, very briefly, I'm going to go down the line, and could you actually tell me what corporate culture actually is? If you have to define it, and I'll start with you, Mel, unfortunately.
So in a nutshell, the way I describe it when people ask me is it's how we do things around here. What we mean by that is at the heart of how any organisation does anything is its beliefs and assumptions around how to do business. But you can see that played out in conversations, decisions and meetings every single day, in the stories that people tell about the organisation and their customers, in the rituals and routines that an organisation pays attention to or ignores, in the things that symbolise the culture. So one of the organisations that I was working with said, we need to change our culture dramatically. What kind of things do we need to change? And I said, well, symbolically, probably the first thing is getting rid of the directors' parking right outside the front entrance, which is even closer than the visitors' parking, and maybe the gilded doors and super carpets when everyone else is in a very different situation would be symbolically very powerful as well. So it's how we do things around here, not necessarily what we do, but how we do, how we talk about it. How we talk about our people. Do we talk about them as colleagues, or do we talk about them as staff? And it's all of those things that bring culture to life and make it quite visible, actually.
And who do you work with? Friends, colleagues, or countrymen?
All of the above. So I agree, Mel, that culture is the way we do things around here. And I guess the other way that I define culture is if you work in a huge organisation like, certainly ours, how do you know that people are doing the right thing? Even because obviously you can't watch people or monitor them all the time. And the answer to that is your culture. It's culture that makes people do the right thing. If you try and give it a sort of more formal definition, you see things like culture is a set of unwritten rules which drive behaviours. And the word unwritten, I think, points to one of the first problems that a lot of us have with this, because I think the point of culture is that you can't write it down or define what is PwC's culture, what's Grant Thornton's culture, because these rules, if you like, are unwritten. For me, actually, the key is, if you say it's a set of unwritten rules that drives behaviour, the key is actually in behaviours, and that's how you see culture actually exhibit itself in what people actually do and how they do it.
Okay, David, I guess it's your job to actually write these rules down as the FRC.
Good luck.
So I just wondered how you define it, or how you're currently trying to define it at the moment as a regulator.
Well, we're doing a report on corporate culture now, and we intend to publish that later in the month. But we've been very, very clear from the start, just to sort of make sure that people understand this is nothing to do with our codes or writing rules down at all. What we wanted to explore, legislation and regulation and codes, they all influence people's behaviour in the workplace, but ultimately they don't control it. So we wanted to explore that area where there was not exactly the lack of control, but what other influences were happening to individuals and organisations beyond that sort of safe regulatory world that we understand it in the FRC, and that as has been pointed out, is difficult to do. We came under a lot of pressure to put a definition in the reports, which I said will hopefully be coming out in a month or so's time. We heard all the definitions that there are. We were bombarded with definitions, and some people really don't like to use the C word at all. They will talk about ethics, or they will talk about integrity, or values, or behaviours. I mean, what we came up with was that actually it's a combination of all of those things. It's a combination of the values. I think you probably begin with values, the attitudes, and then the behaviours that a company as a whole manifests in its own operations, and importantly, and increasingly importantly, the relationships that it has with its stakeholders. And when we talk about stakeholders, we're not simply talking about shareholders, we're talking about a wide range of stakeholders, from its employees, customers, suppliers, and yes, wider society. More difficult to describe and explain, but that's important as well.
Okay, you mentioned you're not making it as a rule or putting it in the corporate governance code. Is corporate culture the same as corporate governance? How do the two things interlink? Are they one of the same? Do they have to exist in isolation together? What would be your take on that, David?
Yeah. We generally take a definition of corporate governance, which is to do with transparency and accountability, and the relationship between the board and the committees of the board and the shareholders. One of the things that's coming out of this report, one of the ideas we have, is to expand that definition. And we can expand that definition without having to change the law, without having to change any regulations, because actually we have a very flexible framework in the UK which can deal with all of that. So to attempt to answer your question more directly, they overlap inevitably. And governance we view as more that traditional relationship within the company and the shareholders. Culture we tend to view building on top of that. I mean, we think that good governance underpins good culture, because if you take the principles of good governance, which are openness and accountability, and you try and apply those beyond the traditional themes of the company, and start talking about employees and wider stakeholders, that's when governance becomes useful, because I know that some people don't always regard it as useful. That's when it becomes useful if you can take those principles, transparency, openness and accountability, and apply them to your stakeholders, then you've got the foundations of a good culture.
Okay. Julie, you mentioned earlier about it being an unwritten set of rules. Well, interestingly, we had Sir Clive Woodward here earlier, brandishing his black book, and in it were hundreds of rules. But he associated it with teamship. His idea that the people who worked with him, as in the England rugby team and other people he's worked with, set those rules, he then policed them. And that kind of created a culture of mentality within the team. So I just wondered, while they might be unwritten, I just wanted your thoughts on this teamship element of where does corporate culture start in the business? It's for the bottom up, from those that said it, or is it from the top down? And how do you make that happen?
Okay, so there's quite a few different questions in there, but I'll do my best. So I do think, and maybe this is where Sir Clive was coming from, it's really important to be quite pragmatic. So we've said that values are quite an important part of culture, but if you just go to employees and say, right, here are our values, integrity, teamwork, professionalism, whatever, that it's going to make no difference, because they are inherently not pragmatic. So people probably have heard this before, but at Enron, at their headquarters, they had carved into the floor the Enron corporate values, all of which were these fabulous things. So all of their employees used to walk over those values every day. One of which was integrity. And so clearly that didn't really work. So pragmatism is really important. So if I think about Sir Clive's Black Book, I think what you have to do for all of your people is translate the values into practical things they can do. And this is back to what I was saying about behaviours. You have to tell people, yeah, we've got those values, but this is actually how we expect you to behave, and give some examples of them. We did something at PwC years and years ago now, which I still think was one of the most effective things that we've done, which we called 10 small things. And we were trying to better instill in people the importance of looking after clients. So we said every day, you've got to do these 10 small things. And the first one was you've got to leave a personal voicemail message, not just, you failed to get hold of Jilly, please leave a message after the tone, but hi, it's Jilly, it's the 28th of June, today I'm going to be out of the office, etc. And so we got people just to do the 10 small things, these tiny things every day. And by translating the value, which was we want to give really amazing client service, into 10 practical things that people could do, we had a much, much more profound effect.
Okay. I just wondered as well how businesses, and we'll get onto the CFO's role in a moment, do know whether they have a healthy or an unhealthy one. In the case of whether it's a co-op or VW or Toshiba or others, I don't know how prevalent it was within the company to know we're about to, get into serious trouble here, and what the role culture plays. Obviously, they don't go out and intend to have a negative one. So how do you see the warning signs? And is there any way to see it before? Is it always after the fact? You can look at it in hindsight and realise where it went wrong. How do you assess it beforehand to see it coming down the track?
And this is where I think the relationship with corporate governance and culture becomes very important. So I certainly know, working with a number of boards and excos, that a lot of attention is paid to the strategy. What are we going to do? What's the plan? What's the operational impact and efficiency? And I just don't hear as often the conversation around how do we do this in a way that aligns to our external brand, the culture that we want to create, the people we want to attract into the organisation. It's kind of like that's not the comfortable conversation to have. And until we, I think, hold those as equally important and give them equal time and attention, then we'll keep getting bitten by some of these cultural issues. And quite often, certainly senior teams, it comes as a surprise because they're just not walking the floors enough. They're not out talking to their customers and their people and really finding out what's going on for them. And we've seen that in a slightly more profound and pronounced way in the last week. The early warning signs are there. They're always there. It's just how connected are we as leaders to see and really observe those early warning signs.
Okay. David, do you have anything to...
Measurement is the thing that came out, and this would be one of the key areas, I think, for CFOs. I mean, and we were, again, bombarded with the number of metrics, the number of things that you can use to measure. And it's easy to say this, but once you've decided on your purpose and then you decide on the strategy and the how, you then have to look at the measures. And you have to think about what measures are appropriate to your particular business, taking into account the decisions that you've made. And then you select those measures, and you will come across measures which are giving you different or almost contradicting pieces of information. And then you have to find out a way of understanding why that is taking place, and then what actually information what information you're actually understanding, and then in presenting this, in presenting management information to the board in a way that is, and you have to be open about it where you've got those contradictions as well.
Okay, what kind of measurements are we talking about? Because I always saw culture as kind of quite an intangible thing, and when I talk to finance directors, CFOs, they look at KPIs that are very tangible. You can put metrics to different performance measures. When you look at culture, it's kind of hard to grasp. So I just wanted, without telling each company what their measure should be, what kind of examples are there in this kind of things, particularly a finance function, should look at?
As a whole, I mean, I'll pick one. Expenses. Might be a really small, might be a small thing, depends on the business that you're in. We were fortunate enough to interview chairs and CEOs and CFOs as well, and this came up quite a lot. There are ways in which you could look at expenses and expenses claims, particularly in terms of your, and I don't want to dwell on this, it's just the one that came into my head, in terms of the way you run your business, in terms of the policy that you have, in terms of checking out across, in a global business, how they're claimed, and how you actually sort of measure them as they're submitted, what people are claiming, why people are claiming, the levels of claims. And we found a few occasions, which of course I'm not at liberty to talk about, where that small thing homed in on a much bigger problem.
Okay. In terms of measurement then, Julie, you look like you're about to speak. So
So I was. I think particularly for a group like us, where I guess lots of people in the room come from a finance background, and me included, I do think measurement is really important, but it's, I think you have to accept that some of this is not going to be about quantitative, empirical data, which may not come naturally to those of us who are accountants in the room. So you can measure quite a lot through observation, even though you can't necessarily put a number to something. Stuff like clean desk policy, the pride that people take in their workplace, are they keeping it, looking great or not? That can tell you quite a lot about how people are feeling at work. That sounds quite touchy-feely and you can't put a number on it. But you can actually measure quite a lot through looking at some of those sort of non-empirical things as well.
Okay, Mel, obviously Grant Thornton's gone through its own kind of cultural shift. Maybe for the people who obviously will not be aware of it, you can explain very briefly, but then look at how, these unempirical things that you looked at during your kind of cultural change at your firm.
Yeah. So, Grant Thornton is a firm that is fundamentally, its heritage is in finance. So we have probably 4/5 of our client-facing population are accountants by trade. And Grant Thornton has spent many years, up until 5 years ago, really encouraging technical expertise, so that if someone from Grant Thornton came to see you, they would have a point of view, and they would be very willing to share that with you. And what we were realising, in much the same way finance directors have been, or CFOs have been helping their teams become business partners instead of technical experts, we've been doing that in Grant Thornton, helping our people to understand it's okay to have a point of view, but you really need to understand in depth the situation before you have one. So this concept of moving more towards being question-led rather than answer-led, taking the time to understand. And that it's been quite a big shift culturally for us to go through. So the first thing that we did was started to look at step one, what do we have today? What exists today, and how is it all, how can you almost capture it? And we captured it in a cultural web. So we pulled out some of the fundamental assumptions that we based the running of our business on, a partnership being one of them. And then we looked at all of the other things. And I noticed one of the speakers earlier said that in their culture, they didn't have a culture of celebrating success. Well, that was one of the things that we identified in our culture. We tended to hone in when things went wrong, as opposed to celebrating when things went right. So if you can map and track things like that, so we mapped the culture as it is and the culture we wanted to have, and then we worked with our people to say, how do we make the shifts? Because to your point, you can't tell adults how to behave. They tend to resist that and become quite animated in that resistance. But actually, if you work on it together and say, this is where we are, this is where we need to get to, and it's in everyone's interest for us to achieve it, how do we do it? We had swathes of people coming forward and this real energy and excitement for change.
Okay.
So it's done if you engage the people. If you don't, then it's, I was about to swear, very hard work.
Yeah, it's before the watershed. We'll save that to after Alistair Darling. Julie?
Yeah, I think something that is now very interesting and definitely worth thinking about is how you can, with the amazing technology we have now, how you can do that virally. And actually, I think things might actually get easier in terms of how you change stuff like you're talking about, because we've got the ability to instigate this sort of really viral change through technology. So maybe through social media. I have a really simple example, this actually isn't particularly technological, of on a Friday night with a group of people who I work closely with, we all share an email saying, and the email is titled, This Week I. And you've got to finish the email with an example of something you've done that week to make a positive difference to somebody's life at PwC, however tiny it is. And by that sort of collaborative sharing through a relatively large group of people, you can actually quite quickly change the way people behave. And there's also a bit of peer pressure in there. So if you're the person that hasn't sent your email on a Friday afternoon, I sometimes can be found on a Friday running around looking for somebody to be nice to. Always a good time to call me.
I'll phone you up for a quote on Friday then, yeah.
But you can use these sort of viral sharing techniques to actually spread quite effectively through an organisation.
Okay, and there's something else I want to ask with PwC specific, is you talked earlier about culture and how it comes to reputation in your brand. PwC
And they know where you're going.
Is very diverse,
Yeah.
equal opportunity, but how can you extend that brand and that culture out to suppliers? Is it something you can enforce upon your suppliers? And for example, maybe you can elaborate on how PwC had an issue with a supplier, which maybe cut to the heart of what your culture as a business is about.
Yeah, definitely. So if there is anybody in the room that doesn't know what Richard's alluding to, we're now going to talk about Heelgate, which was a situation that arose, it's probably a little over a month ago now, where at PwC we outsource our front of house sort of reception activity. And a lady coming in to work for the company that we outsource that to, she arrived at PwC and she was told by her employer, who technically was not PwC, you can't work here because you're wearing flat shoes. And the dress code policy is that you've got to wear at least 2-inch heels. And that lady, who we all now know was called Nicola Thorpe, thought this was outrageous, which brackets, by the way, it is, and went and created her petition and so on. So the big learning here for PwC is that we had defined our culture, our values, our behaviours, and they are reflected in PwC's dress code. So we say to our people, we trust you to make judgments about how it's appropriate to dress. But what we've not done is remembered that actually today we don't live in this closed circle, which is our company with a hard line over it. We've got a supply chain. And we hadn't looked down our supply chain at this particular supplier and asked ourselves, well, are they reflecting all of the same values, culture, behaviours as us? And sure enough, as we now know, they weren't. So we had to respond pretty quickly. Both in that situation, we told the company who does our front of house services, you've got to change your dress code. And we've also had to go through all of our suppliers' contracts, their own dress codes, their behaviour standards to make sure they are all consistent with what we do at PwC. So the message is really that culture doesn't exist within the boundary of a legal entity. You've got to look much wider at all of the people you're engaging with.
Excellent.
Big learning.
Julie, thank you very much for that. David, I want to put it back to a bit more of the dry end of board issues again now. And I know when I was citing Ken Elisa before with my sort of abstract art comment, it was part of a big report Cass Business School did with the IOD, looking at how you can do like a framework, a checklist, and this is more about good governance, the number of board meetings you have, how many votes, what's the engagement, and all that kind of stuff. So it's like a checklist of healthy corporate governance. Now, can that be done that way, and does that apply in the same way to culture, having these kind of very arbitrary measures?
My initial reaction to that is that I will be, you would expect this answer in a way. Checklists have their place. Checklists can tell you things, but if we go back to measurement, they can't tell you everything. There will be points on that list that are not being checked. Is the checklist long enough? I mean, you said what can you measure, and I then quickly went to our draft report, where I have 25 measures that people use. I don't know. I think people will find it helpful. because there might be a few on the list that they're not using, or they might have thought of some more. We're asking for feedback as well. They might have thought of some more. And we thought, it's when you create a list, how long do you want the list to be? But in the end, we decided, let's go with the list and let's tell people, because they might, it's one of those things they might find helpful. But we are a principles-based regulator, and whilst I know that some people feel that the code has an element of box ticking and checklist about it, for example, it is comply or explain. And if you apply that sort of principle to culture as well, so if you're non-compliant, you start to explain. I think it's very healthy that you were prepared to come on and say, you know, you had an issue, and therefore, and you explained what you did about it. And okay, it's after the event, but it's still a good thing to do, because then it gives that sort of example. So checklists have their place,
okay.
but you've got to understand why you put the checklist in place in the first place and what's on the checklist.
Yep. Okay, so far this has been pretty nice and fluffy and all about that, but I think in the audience of finance types, does it have a bottom line? Impact, can you actually invest in it? So before we go to you guys, I just wondered, from like show of hands again in the room, how many people actively invest in their corporate culture within their own business? Okay, so a few, yeah, okay. But, so is that something you agree with? Can it be invested in? How would you invest within your corporate culture? What does that actually mean in practice? Gilly?
So yes, I certainly think you can invest in it. So we've certainly got a team, and I suspect it might be similar to the one you work in, Mel, that you know, spends its life helping people invest in corporate culture. And there's also, I think you've seen this, Richard, quite a lot of research now that shows that if you invest in corporate culture, sure enough, the benefits do come through on the bottom line. EY have just done a piece of work that sets that out. So it's certainly investable. What are the kinds of things you do? I mean, it's a lot about what we're talking about, deciding what behaviours you want, deciding how you're going to measure them, and putting something systematic in place to do that. That's the kind of programme that I'd expect people to be thinking about.
No, is that the kind of a programme you expect? You got anything you can add?
Well, I think I like the question about the bottom line, because I heard a speaker talk about culture as, or the people stuff as the soft stuff, and my experience is it's quite hard to do that. But there is lots and lots of research now that says if you can create the kind of culture that really engages your people, you will see the impact in terms of reduction in sickness and absence. So disengaged people on average 6.5 days of sick leave, as opposed to engaged people where it's 2.5% or 2.5 days. You can already see the productivity shift. People who are highly engaged, bringing 80% of themselves to work and really giving their all. People disengaged, you'll probably get 40% of their effort and their input. You can measure that as well. So I think it's highly measurable, and but it has a lead time. You have to be prepared to invest, because there's quite a bit of cynicism about why organisations are investing in culture. Are they doing it genuinely to create the right environment for their people, or is there really, we're doing this and it should get us the bottom line really quickly? And you've got to kind of hold your faith with that. Okay. And I think CFOs have a really big part to play in this, because the case for change often comes out of data and information. And CFOs have access to brilliant management data and management information, and can create a really compelling story behind the success of an organisation, or what the organisation needs to do to be successful going forwards. So, yeah.
And who's going to be best placed to kind of keep on top of this, you know, in the future? Is it a case that it's for management, or are they too close? That's the role of board as custodian. Or is it a role, you know, auditors provide obviously assurance on the numbers at the back end. You increasingly want to provide assurance on the front end narrative section of corporate reports, and the way that annual reports are changing to become, you know, they have different value drivers and different business drivers. So is there a role for external auditors to get involved? I'm sure as working for a big accountancy firm, you might say yes. Or maybe it's that of internal audit, or even the regulator, although in this case, David, you don't particularly want to regulate that particular element. So we'll just go down the line. I'll start with you, Mel. Who is best placed to kind of help keep on top of that?
So in the first instance, our belief is that culture needs to be absolutely owned by the board and the management team, because too often it's outsourced to HR, and I think that's setting HR up to fail. It needs to come from the people who are talking to their people every day. Then it also needs someone who isn't as close to it to be able to take an objective view and say, is this really being owned? And I like the question about the checklist in terms of measuring, is it working? I think it always depends on what's the intention. Is it, oh yeah, tick the checklist? Or is it, we're passionate about this, we need to be checking on it regularly? So the attitude and the passion has to come from the leadership team. And then there needs to be someone outside of that who can be dispassionate about how is that being properly, is it getting the right traction and the right results? Is it going to deliver to all of the stakeholders? And that could be internal audit or it could be external audit. And certainly Grant Thornton, we have an internal audit function that works closely, and more we're being asked to audit the whole holistic organisation, not just the financial aspects of it.
Julie?
So I thought that was a great answer, and so I'm not going to repeat it because I just agree with it. I'm going to add one thing though about another group that I think has responsibility for culture. So absolutely agree with what Mel said about the board and senior leadership. I think you also have to look for a group of, I'm going to call them informal leaders. So these aren't your CEO, CFO, whatever. And in fact, they've probably not got any title, but they are people who are hugely influential in your business. So there's a guy at PwC, one of my colleagues, a chap called Andy Woodfield, works in our consulting overseas development business, hugely charismatic. He's all over social media, and he's just got a massive following at PwC. He's got no management role, but he's very, very influential in a really positive way. So you also have to look for those informal leaders and get them working with you as well. And otherwise, I suspect you can't make change happen.
Okay, and just a final point, I think, on leaders, and just prompted me to remember a different bit of research. Do you need devil's advocate leaders? You know, how much for corporate culture to work on a board do you need someone who takes a contrary position to the rest of the board to really challenge how it's set and assessed? Everyone doesn't seem to think they will have a healthy one, or you need that devil's advocate kind of leader.
So I think you need, this sounds very predictable, you've got to have diversity on a board or in any kind of sort of leadership group. And I absolutely don't mean diversity of gender, ethnicity, although you know, you might end up having that, but you've got to have diversity of perspective and experience and background, and people that will come in and bring different views, not to be devil's advocate for the sake of being devil's advocate, but just because they've got different experiences to bring to the table. So I'm not a big fan of conflict for conflict's sake, but I am a big fan of that diversity of view coming together. Okay,
you never would have got on with the 2003 England rugby team then. Okay, I think that's pretty much my main question. We've got some time to throw it open to the audience. So did anyone have anything they wanted to ask about governance, culture, or anything relevant to our panel? Just Arif over there, please. Thank you, Arif.
Thank you. Mel, you said that to bring about change in culture, you need to engage people. Would you tell us something about how you went about that process and how you got the engagement of people in your business when you went on this change journey?
Yes, of course. And I'll build up on Julie's point as well, in that because we have a partnership, we knew we needed to get our partners involved really early on. And to the question around, do you need leaders who have a different point of view? Our belief is you do need diversity, you need different thinking, and you need challenge. But actually at senior level, you need people aligned to the organisation's values. And if they are not aligned to it and fundamentally don't agree with them, then you have to be prepared to do something about it. So we did take quite a hard look at our partnership and see who is fighting this and going to make this really difficult, and what do we do about that? And we people marked them with senior leaders so that they had almost like, if you've read the book, Our Iceberg is Melting, they had someone on their shoulder every time they were talking against it. And the fact we don't need to change, we had oh yes, we do need to change. We literally had them people marked. But then we went into the organisation and said, who are the 10% at every part of our organisation? Who are those 10% that really want the organisation to be successful and are prepared to stand up and do things differently to make that happen? And we put an advocacy programme in place, and we upskilled them so that they had the common language, they had the ability to build rapport and engage with people in such a way to have a different kind of conversation. And we also we did a lot on social media as well.
Okay.
It takes time as well to do that. The worst thing you can do is try and rush it and tick the box. I think you have to sign up to, if you're doing cultural change, it's forever.
Okay, forever is a very long time. David Tilson. So, thank you.
Question for David Stiles. Can you say a bit about where the FRC is aiming to take culture to? I mean, is this something that where the auditors are going to have to sign off that you're culturally sensitive, or does comply and explain? And I was sort of thinking about something like a BHS, where you've got a CEO who's a bit of a tyrant, and you've got a chairman who's a bit of a pussycat. How does it play through? How would that, what's the end result?
Okay. From the beginning, we've been clear that we want to make observations, and observations that people can have a practical application that people can work on. We're not interested in sign-offs. Interestingly, of course, the code the corporate governance code says, and has said for a number of years, that the board is responsible for the company's values. I mean, that word actually appears in the code. We also issue board effectiveness guidance, which mentions culture as well. Actually, it doesn't develop the idea, because when it was published 5 years ago or so, it wasn't necessary at the time. So when we publish our report, we're going to be very interested in the reaction to it. We have our annual conference on the 20th September this year, where we'll be talking about this issue in greater depth. I'm going to use the report and the feedback to look at the guidance that we've got and see if we can develop that further. But again, I want to reassure you that when you say, where is it going, what we're trying to encourage is a debate, and for companies, and within the FTSE, even with FTSE 100, you have companies of obviously in different sectors, different sizes, different stages of development. To think about it in their context and what they need to do. It's not a question of direction from the FRC in that context, but what it is an understanding that if you look at this in terms of legislation, regulation, and codes, you won't get an answer, because we've had the financial crisis. Financial regulations have been put in place to attempt to deal with some of that. We've been asked to look at it in terms of the wider corporates beyond the finance sector, and what it is that companies can do to attempt to prevent misconduct and failure. You will never get rid of it. We're accepting that you will never get rid of it entirely. That's not possible. And we have to have, there's a debate to be had about what level, if the awkward debate, what level of misconduct, which is linked also to risk, which is very important, which we haven't mentioned, is not exactly acceptable, but what are we prepared to tolerate? And our ideas are beyond legislation, regulation codes, to have a proper debate about it, try and minimise that, and that's all to do with confidence and integrity and restoring trust in business.
Okay, and I know no one's willing to tolerate me running over, so I've got time for one more question, if there are any. Okay, great. I'll go for the gentleman there. Sorry, thank you, Molly. And then if we've got time, if everyone's very brief, there's a lady down there.
I was just wondering, to what extent do you think financial incentives should play in a corporate's culture in driving the right behaviours?
Julie?
Yeah, so I think it's critical, and that's because you've got to have all of this stuff aligned. So once you've thought about your culture, you've set out your values, you've thought about what behaviours you want people to exhibit, if you've then got a set of incentives or a remuneration system that is driving people to do only a subset of those behaviours, or maybe even completely different ones, the whole thing will go horribly wrong. So I don't think it's all about incentivisation, but if you don't have your incentives aligned, I think you don't even pass go.
Okay, and very, very finally, there was a lady just down the front who had her hand up as well. That's it. We're keeping you very fit today, Mona. Thank you.
I've heard a lot recently about new graduates having a very different approach to interacting with one another and communicate, well, with everybody, interaction across the business and communication. Do you think this will have a significant impact on corporate culture, and how can you take control of that?
Mel, do you want to take that one, please?
I think it absolutely will, and I think it's going to be really refreshing. Already in the organisations that we're speaking to, they're asking questions like, how do we get ready for this? But they're viewing it as an opportunity. Slightly alarming as well, what are all the things we're going to need to shift? Because they have a completely different way of engaging, and they are not in any way shy about talking about how they feel if they don't get what they want as well. So this transparency and high expectation. If we're going to really attract great talent, most of the organisations we're speaking to are looking at fundamentally reorganising and reinventing themselves as an organisation. So I think it's really exciting times.
Excellent. Right, and to keep on time, that I'll bring the panel to an end and just leave me to thank Mel, Gillian and David for all taking part. If you could welcome me.